traffic.
There's some seats
It's
over
only
here.
4:59.
Oh, yeah. Lee is good. He starts on time.
You're transmitting.
Okay, whenever you're
Okay.
ready, Mr. Lopez. Can you tell them they're seating over there on the
The seating on the left.
Are you going to come back and sit here?
No, ma'am.
I'll put my shawl there.
Good afternoon, everybody.
I'm good.
Welcome to our monthly member speaker series. Today we have the pleasure of hearing the story of our friend and neighbor, John McLaughlin. John and I have enjoyed each other's company for the past 20 plus years. We play tennis and bi-monthly poker in Sea Pines and now at Tide Point. John has an amazing story to tell us, especially his 31 years in the world of international intelligence, in the Army, CIA, and as a private consultant. John is a native of North Carolina, growing up in the town of Rayford. He is a graduate of Davidson College and Georgetown Law Center. He is a member of the Virginia State Bar. John was a Cold War warrior, serving 2 years as an Army intelligence officer and 31 years as an intelligence consultant with Booz Allen. He and his wife, Ellie, moved to Hilton Head Island in 1998, where he currently enjoys playing tennis, bocce ball, lying on the beach, and socializing with his friends in Sea Pines and Tide Point. Please welcome me in welcoming John McLaughlin.
Okay, I just wanted you to know that at one time I was a fairly young man. This was about 2/3 of the way through my career. And at that time I had thyroid cancer, but they discovered it when I moved over to work with the National Intelligence Staff. And as a result, I had to have the thyroid surgery. My boys said, Dad, since you can't shave, why don't you grow a beard? I did. I kept it for a year. I waited for time to be able to shave it off because I hated it. And the only way I could do it was when I got the beard and I went back to the Pentagon. They said, oh, now you're one of them working over with CIA. And so a year later, I actually moved permanently to the CIA. I went back to the Pentagon. I went about to see everybody. I shaved it off Sunday. And I said, now I'm one of y'all. Now, the other thing is, as Ellie knows very well, I speak Southern. And when I was in law school, I had a law professor in constitutional law. I got up to give a brief a case, and I thought I did a good job. I went to sit down. He said, so I stayed, said, would you repeat that? I went through and I embellished even better. And I went to sit down. And he said, Mr. McLaughlin, what language are you speaking? So hopefully I can, and I learned I had to hit my consonants, particularly when I was doing briefing of the intelligence to the officials. I hope I hit enough consonants today so you can understand what I'm saying. First, on my roots, Scottish roots, McLaughlin. This is the Lachlan Castle. It's on the Cowal Peninsula in Loch Fyne, which is just to the west and north of Glasgow. over on the western coast. It got bombarded after Bonnie Prince Charlie lost the Battle of Culloden, and after that the British came up Loch Fyne and all the other lochs and bombarded all the castles for the clan chiefs that had supported Bonnie Prince Charlie. Obviously, we were one of them. North Carolina are my roots. This shows the state, and if you look at the three sections, the colors on the map really demonstrate what's there. You have the coastal plain with lots of sand. That's where I lived and grew up. You have the Piedmont with hills and lots of vegetation, trees, and then the mountains. Where I grew up was in Rayford, circled there, which is right near on the western side, and it was near Fort Bragg military reservation. This is my paternal grandfather's home. It was on what's now the Fort Bragg military reservation. He was a turpentine producer. Of course, when Fort Bragg came in, they had to leave. They got evicted. This is my family. I was a love baby. You see the little child there in my mom's hands, arms? That is I. And then I have my siblings going from right to left. The youngest one was 9 years older. My sister was 10 years older than I. And my other brother, Tom, was 12 years older. They didn't really get to like me at all, they being my brothers. My sister was very nice to me. Brothers were not. One time I was in the backyard playing with my cars, making roads and bridges and stuff. All of a sudden, I saw a little puff of dust going up. I said, my God. And I looked up at the roof. My two brothers were up there with the air rifles shooting at me. I got the heck out of there and into the house. This is my hippie days, about 3 years old. I had long hair for some time. Unfortunately, I don't really remember that. This is my watermelon time, fun time with a friend, neighbor. I'm on the right. Everybody's first grade picture. This is a swimming hole that we had in Rayford. We didn't have a swimming pool, but we had the greatest swimming hole. You see it inside the circle there, and the dark streak you see is the creek itself. We used to, every year we would build our own diving board. We had diving platforms on the trees, and we had a heck of a good time there. Here I am on my bike, getting ready for my paper route. I got a paper route in 44. My family has a custom or a rule. When you reach 10 years old, you no longer get an allowance. You got to go out and make some money. So I got a paper route that year, and that was the best thing I could have ever done, because with that paper route, I made about $16 a week and more later. That today is like earning $264 a week. I had the most spending money then I've ever had in my life. And I had fun. I was also in the band, played clarinet. I started out with the brass wind clarinet, which was my brother's. Then I had some money, so I bought me a new one, which was a woodwind clarinet. Those days, it was the most expensive one they had, which was $200. That today is a little over about $2,000. I wouldn't have done it today if I'd had any sense. Played basketball, also football and baseball in high school, but I really liked basketball. And there I had the tendency to dribble very low, stick my butt out. When I get under the basket for a rebound, I was short, as you can see, but I was still the second tallest guy on the team. And I would get under there, get the inside position, and go and that would push the taller guys out, and I could go get a rebound. Davidson College, went there in 52 to 56. Started as a pre-ministerial student, Presbyterian Church. Sophomore year, I decided that was not my calling. I then signed up for ROTC for the last 2 years because I figured we had the draft then. If I went in, I'd have to go in at some point, so I might as well go in as an officer. Between reporting to Army duty and graduation, I, and together with 3 friends, took a trip to Europe on a student ship. That student ship had a wonderful ratio of gals to guys, 2 to 1. They had dance bands all night. The bar stayed open till about 11:30. We tipped the steward $20. That's about $263 today. I wouldn't have done it if it had been that much. Anyway, after the band stopped playing, we'd go back to our cabin, and he would have 2 big platters of cold cuts and cheeses and baked bread and 4 bottles of wine. So during our dancing during the evening, we would select who was the lucky girl to come back to our cabin. Oh man, and by the way, it was a 9-day trip over and back. What a time. Now on the ship, I met Ellie, but I had absolutely nothing to do with her. She never was invited back to the cabin. And about a year later, we met, where I went to a concert, the National Symphony Orchestra in Washington, and my God, there she was at intermission. I spied her. I had no idea what her name was. I had a blind date. I asked the blind date, and says, "Oh, I know who she is." "Oh, you do?" And "Yes, that's Ellie Gullickson." "Oh, thank you." So that weekend, called her up. 9 months later, we were married. We had 3 children. Excuse me. Here, going from right to left, that's 1st grade, our youngest, 3rd grade, and 6th grade. They're all happily married, employed, and not living with us. We have 7 grandchildren scattered around there. Again, they're all happy, but no great-grandchildren yet. We have 1 granddaughter that's married. Also with our family, and we decided that going to our home in Rayford with my mother there, ruling the roost, was not very much fun. So we all decided we had to go somewhere else. We went to Pawleys Island, and we've been going there. This is the 1st year. 1 house. This is what we do at happy hour. We all get in a circle with our chairs and drinks. And it's been a magnificent way to keep the family together. And we have fun. That's where I learned to play bocce ball. Then I went into the Army. And reported to Fort Bliss, Texas. Went to the Surface Air Missile School. A real experience for a history major. Then I went to the Army Intelligence School at Fort Hollywood, right outside Baltimore. There I was in the imagery interpretation class. This is where I worked first after the school. It's interesting, it's a Ford building, it's a black building. Ford Stewart Company was in the first 3 floors. We had the top 4 floors. And where it's circled, that's where, that little corner area there, that's where I worked as an imagery analyst for those 4 years, 5 years. This was the time, and it was the U-2 that had been approved by Eisenhower. It was built, been produced, designed and produced by Kelly Johnson, and it took Kelly Johnson only about a year to design and produce it once it was approved by President Eisenhower. Fantastic effort. And then here's what I worked on as an imagery analyst. We were really concerned about the Soviet Union and their strategic missile threat. That would be the ICBMs, the intercontinental, as well as the lesser range. And I focused my effort on the two major missile test and training facilities. Kapustin Yar on the left by the Volga River, and the Tyura-Tam facility just to the east of Aral Sea. And I became pretty knowledgeable with these. This is Tyura-Tam. This is the launch site for the SS-6, which is their first generation ICBM. Also, it provided the booster for all of their space shots. And because they got their space shot up first, we thought that they were 6 feet tall on everything. But it turns out that the missile program was really not as far advanced as ours. The inset in the bottom is an open source photo I found later on, so you can get a better feel. When you're looking at pictures like this, you see the shadow. Look for the shadow, and then that allows you to get a sense of depth, even though you have no three-dimensional view. And I'll mention at this time what's important in analyzing and interpreting imagery are four S's. They're the surroundings, the size, the shape. If you have those, and shadow, like the shadow, with those three things, it's pretty easy to look at things vertically, even without three-dimensional view, and determine, and you can even work out, measure the heights. This is a very important picture. The actual picture you see here is from later commercial satellite imagery, like Landsat, that you can get now easily. But at the time that this was taken, it was taken by the U-2, and if you notice on either side, it's sort of grayed out. And that's because the coverage of Tyura-Tam was very cloud covered. Couldn't see a thing. We thought we had missed it completely. But I was working on the photography and discovered one hole in the clouds. And in that hole was this site under construction. The importance of that was the construction was for a training site for the second generation ICBM for the Soviets. And we were very concerned about whether that had been deployed yet, because their first generation site was just not, that missile was just too cumbersome, not that effective. This was important because you do not deploy operational missiles until you have, one, had a site built to be able to test the facility itself out, and then to use it for training of the soldiers who are going to be manning the site. It's very critical to have an operational deployment to have something like this. It was missing until this point in time, April of 1960, but still under construction. However, right after April 60, the next mission we had with the U-2 was shot down. And Gary Powers survived and was later exchanged with another Soviet years later. Fortunately for us, in the analytical world, the scientific world side of our intelligence had been working for years to design a satellite that would be able to take imagery from the satellite, and then they had re-entry vehicles or capsules where they came out with the film in it and came down, and then a parachute opened up, and by God, You then had a transport aircraft with a scooper behind it. If you see in the circle, you'll see the parachute with the payload, the capsule on the, hanging from it. They didn't miss but one in all the missions that we had. That was picked up by the Navy divers on surface ships. Now, this time of the year, the era, we had this debate between Kennedy and Nixon. And Kennedy in the debate was claiming a missile gap. Now, what I just went through before with our analysis that we have with the imagery, we were able to confirm that instead of having about 200 launchers deployed for the ICBM, they only had about 25 max. That made a big difference during the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62 because we knew they did not have, there was no gap. They are the ones that suffered the gap. This is our first identification of the sets up here. That's the only thing they really had deployed prior to the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were just a limited number of the second generation ICBMs that were deployed. And that made a big difference in the position that our leadership were in during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We had an upper hand. And you can see that looks similar to this. And the size and shape again are what help you to identify that. Then we hit with the new satellite imagery, which provided a lot of what you call broad area coverage. In other words, one picture covered 150 miles in width. And it allowed you to get a lot of coverage of the real estate and be able to search it for anything, any new activity like construction of ICBM sites. And with that, we were able to determine that during this period of time, up to '62, they were just starting construction of the second generation sites. And once again, we were able to confirm that they only had about 25 operational ICBMs at that time. Well,
Yeah, anyway.
went the wrong way. Yeah. Come on.
It's going the wrong way.
I'm failing.
No, you're not.
Okay. Okay, Cuba. Prior to Cuba, we had lots of indications that the Soviets were doing something different, particularly relative to Cuba. They were introducing weapons, defensive weapons there, like surface-to-air missiles, etc. And we had extensive collection resources outgoing. We had communications intercepts, both for telephone, radio. We had ship and sub surveillance of what's coming in. Had the U-2, the satellite. Had a human source in the Kremlin. And by the way, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was arrested and he was later killed. And then to the left bottom, you'll see group there. They had Tom Hewitt from the CIA, ops officer, and he had a team of Cubans that were deployed in Cuba at the time, all providing information. The U-2, however, with its imagery, is the one that provided the incontrovertible direct evidence of the missiles being there. This is a picture of one of the large hull ships that was carrying strategic missiles, but we couldn't see them and had no way to determine that they were there. Now this is a surface missile, but it's for a cruise missile, and it's against ships. This is a time I had an opportunity to either really screw up or shine, because I was selected to brief that to President Kennedy in the Oval Office. I made it through okay. And you can't see much here, but I'll point out inside the circle, you can see a little linear object. That's the launcher with the cruise missile on board. Mentioned surface-to-air missiles being shipped to Cuba and deployed. This is a picture of one of the sites. It has, we call it the Star of David configuration with the road network servicing the different revetments. The revetments are the dark area you see around where you see the bulldozers that scraped it up to build it. We had a concentration of these sites in one area, and the Soviets only do that when there's something extremely important strategically that requires defense. You see the little area, the red area to the upper left in Cuba? That was the concentration area of surface-to-air missile sites, and that became a place where we had high priority requirement for coverage by the U-2. And by the way, the Soviets picked a good time to do something surreptitiously, because they picked the hurricane season as the time that they were deploying all these things and bringing them in, and we had bad weather for most of the time, up until October. And in October, this was the photograph that allowed us to detect and confirm that missiles were, the medium-range missile, that's the MRBM, is medium-range ballistic missile, were being deployed. In the linear oval, you have a convoy of vehicles. But we've got a second site that was identified soon thereafter. And this one, you had a much better view of the equipment, which even you can see within the yellow circles. If you look at the inset, that's a attaché photograph of the medium-range ballistic missile that was deployed to Cuba. And by analyzing that and comparing it to what we were seeing there, we were able to confirm that, in fact, the strategic missiles were being deployed into Cuba. These are the four guys who did the analysis. Dick Reininger from the Army, Joe Sullivan from the Navy, Jim Holmes from the Air Force, and Vince Lorenzo from CIA. What we had was a joint imagery interpretation outfit there, where all of us were working together for the common goal of trying to get things right and the best information possible to our leadership. Subsequent to that identification, we also discovered the intermediate range ballistic missile being deployed. This is a site under construction. It also had a nuclear warhead facility. On it. There we go. See it down in the bottom right. This is our XCOM. That's a subgroup of the National Security Council. In the yellow, you have John Kennedy, and to the right and on the left side is his brother Robert. You'll notice that he chose in a meeting around a table. he chooses the middle of the table to sit as opposed to the end of the table.